It begins with a rumor whispered in the corridors of medicine and folklore alike, a story dismissed by most as a trick of science, a medical anomaly too rare to believe. And yet, when you strip away the layers of denial and dust off the forgotten records, what remains feels closer to a tale of horror than a clinical note. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before the story pulls you in too deep. Because what you're about to hear is not just a mystery. It is a riddle stitched into flesh, a grotesque secret nature never intended to reveal. The story begins with a young girl born in the mid-20th century in a rural hospital where modern medicine barely touched the edges of old superstition. To the doctors who delivered her, she was perfectly normal. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a strong heartbeat. But as she grew, shadows began to trail her development. Her stomach swelled in ways that could not be explained by food or childhood illness. By the time she reached early adolescence, it was clear she was carrying something within her. The scandal that erupted in her small town is one that the official reports will never capture. Families whispered that she was cursed, touched by sins of her parents. Others claimed her mother had made a pact, passing down something unholy into her bloodline. In reality, science has a name for it: fetus in fetu. A vanishingly rare condition where one twin absorbs the other in the womb, trapping it inside their body. But in this girl's case, the absorbed life didn't die. It grew. It pulsed. It waited. Imagine being a child, your body already a host to something ancient and silent, something that doesn't belong to you, yet shares your blood. To be told that you were born pregnant, not in the sense of scandal, but in the most literal biological horror. It defied both religion and reason. Was she a miracle of bile, OQI, or an abomination carved into the fabric of family history? The answer depends on who dares to speak it aloud. And yet, this was only the beginning. What they discovered inside her would blur the lines between medicine and mythology. When the truth began to unfold, the girl was no longer just a patient. She was a living spectacle. Doctors traveled from miles away, summoned by the hospital staff who could not explain what they were seeing. At first, many believed it was a tumor, a growth, something parasitic consuming her from within. But when the surgeons made their first cautious examinations, they recoiled. What they found was not cancer, not disease, but fragments of a body. There were bones, tiny yet unmistakably human, teeth arranged in odd and uneven ways, as though frozen halfway between life and decay. Hair that seemed too dark, too coarse for a child her age. It was her twin, or at least what should have been her twin, a sibling that had never breathed air, never walked, but continued to exist, trapped within her. In that small rural hospital, the air grew heavy with dread. Nurses whispered prayers under their breath. The priests called to bless the girl's room refused to stay long, claiming the atmosphere itself was wrong, unnatural. Some described hearing noises that no instrument recorded, muffled thuds, like the beating of a second heart. Was it imagination, or was there truly something alive inside her? Science tries to put order to chaos. It explains this condition clinically: fetus in fetu, an incomplete twin growing within its sibling. Yet those who saw her with their own eyes said there was nothing clinical about it. They claimed her belly shifted, her skin stretched in ways that suggested movement, as if the twin, though malformed, still sought release. For the girl, the torment was more than physical. Children in her school called her cursed, a vessel of shame. Her parents, once proud of a healthy daughter, now lived in fear. In town, rumors grew darker. People whispered she carried the child of sin itself. Some claimed the family had long been touched by taboo unions, strength, e-births, and unspoken histories. For every explanation offered by doctors, the town forged a darker one. This was no longer just a girl with a medical mystery. She was a symbol of something ancient, something the community believed should have stayed hidden. And as the years passed, her story became less about science and more about the horror of inheritance. What a family can pass down that no one dares to name. The story should have ended in the hospital. Doctors could have written it off as an anomaly, a rare case to be studied and then forgotten. But it didn't end there, because the girl's condition was not the first of its kind, not in her family, and not in her town. When researchers began digging into her history, they found whispers of similar stories hidden across generations. In old family records, yellowed with age, there were vague entries that spoke of unusual birth, infants described as twice formed or born with company. Some of these children lived short, agonizing lives. Others disappeared quietly from the records altogether, erased as though they had never existed. It was almost as if the family had been trying to cover its tracks, burying each unsettling birth under layers of silence. The community itself carried memories of strange inheritances. Town elders recalled a great-grandmother who was said to have carried a spirit in her belly for nearly a decade. Another tale spoke of a boy whose rib cage was found to contain not just a heart, but fragments of another skull fused into his bones. These accounts, dismissed as folklore, suddenly became chillingly real in light of the girl's condition. But the deeper question remained: why her family? Some doctors suggested that genetics could be at play, that something in the bloodline made these twisted births recur. But outside the clinic walls, another explanation took root. One whispered in the shadows of church steps and over candlelight vigils. The family, people claimed, was cursed. They had broken a law too deep for time to erase, an old sin of blood, a mixing that should never have happened, and every generation bore its mark. The girl herself began to feel the weight of this story. She could not walk through town without feeling eyes on her. In her presence, people crossed themselves, muttered prayers, or looked away entirely. For the townsfolk, she was no longer a child, but a living reminder of what they all feared, that their community was not untouched by darkness. Science tried to explain her condition in sterile words, but the town chose another language. They called her the unborn mother, a girl who carried both herself and another within, as if her very body testified to the sins of her ancestors. And as she grew older, the lines between explanation and myth blurred. No matter what the doctor said, the people were convinced. She was not just a medical mystery. She was proof of something unnatural, something forbidden, something that had never really died in that bloodline. As the girl entered adolescence, the shadow of her past did not fade. It darkened. What had once been whispered as a curiosity now grew into something more sinister. For in her teenage years, the doctors discovered something unsettling. The remains of what they thought had long vanished inside her were not entirely gone. Small traces lingered, fragments of teeth, faint outlines of bone, pockets of tissue embedded deep within her body. To the medical world, it was was a rare but explainable condition. To her community, it was a confirmation of their worst fears. She was not just a girl, she was a doom. The more people spoke of her, the less she felt like a person at all. Some called her two souls in one skin. Others whispered that she was a punishment, born already carrying the burden of another life, like a vessel for sins that were not hers. Neighbors began to watch her movements carefully. If she laughed, they whispered that she carried madness. If she grew sick, they murmured that the second life inside her was stirring. What no one wanted to speak aloud was that some believed this was not just biology. The town's oldest rumors painted her family as keepers of a forbidden union, bloodlines mixed in ways the community could never accept, secrets tangled so tightly that no generation could escape. And so, children were born bearing the imprint of what had come before. Some survived, others did not, but all of them left scars on the family's legacy. The girl herself carried these scars in silence. Late at night, when the town was quiet, she admitted to feeling movements in her body she could not explain. Shifts, aches, faint tremors she described as someone else still living within her. Doctors dismissed it as psychosomatic, her mind exaggerating the trauma of her condition. But her family, the same family who had carried this secret through the decades, looked at her errantly. They did not argue with her. They only warned her never to tell anyone else. By now, her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the story her family had tried to bury, and to the community who refused to forget. She was trapped in both worlds, too medical for myth, too mythical for medicine, and every step she took seemed to lead her closer to the truth of what her bloodline had always hidden, that she was never meant to live a normal life. She was born carrying a secret that was not hers, but that would haunt her until her final breath. As the years went on, the girl could not ignore the feeling that her life was being steered by forces she could not control. The silence of her family was heavier than any illness, and the whispers of the town grew sharper with each passing year. But what disturbed her most was not what others said. It was the fragments of truth she began uncovering in her own home. One evening, while searching through the attic, she stumbled upon a wooden box hidden beneath rotting blankets. Inside were journals, brittle with age, their ink faded but legible. The writings belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had always kept her distance, always avoiding her gaze. And within those pages, the girl found words that made her blood run cold. The grandmother spoke of carrying not just one child, but two. One lived, one did not. Yet the second did not fully vanish. It remained inside, growing, twisting, shaping her into something more than a mother, less than a woman. The journals hinted that this was not the first time it had happened. Generations before, the same condition or curse appeared again and again. Women in their bloodline born carrying the remnants of unborn siblings. Women who described feeling haunted, possessed, incomplete. Some were buried in unmarked graves, erased from history to protect the family name. Others were hidden away, living out their years as silent shadows, forgotten even by their descendants. The girl's hands trembled as she read. Her grandmother's words mirrored her own thoughts, her own nightmares. But then came the passage that changed everything. Her grandmother claimed the family was not cursed by coincidence or biology, but by choice. She wrote that long ago, the family had bound itself together in ways they were never meant to, mixing blood, repeating unions that defied morality and law. The town had once accused them of it, but now here was Evita, ease from within. A forbidden bond had set in motion a cycle that no one could break. The girl realized she was not the first, and she would not be the last. She was part of a legacy too dark to speak aloud, one carried inside the body itself, generation after generation. And though doctors might explain her condition with science, the journals spoke another language, one of punishment, secrecy, and bloodlines cursed to consume themselves. The weight of this truth was suffocating. For the first time, she wondered if the life inside her had not been an accident of biology, but a continuation of a pact her ancestors had made. Something intended, something inevitable. When she finally descended from the attic, clutching the journals to her chest, the house felt smaller, as though its walls leaned inward, listening. Her family sat at the dinner table, their faces stiff as though waiting for her to speak words they already feared. She laid the journals down before them, the brittle pages opening themselves like wounds. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was so heavy it seemed to pulse. Her grandmother's eyes flickered to the box, then quickly away. Her mother's hands tightened around her fork, knuckles white. The girl's voice broke the air, asking questions she already knew the answers to. Is it true? Was I never my own? At first, they denied it. The family claimed she was sick, hysterical, imagining things. But as her words sharpened, pressing harder, their masks began to crack. Her grandmother whispered, "We do not speak of that." Her voice a fragile thread. Her mother, trembling, confessed with tears that she too had found the journals once, and that she too had felt the same shadows within her body. "It passes from one to another," she said, "and none of us escape." The revelation twisted the girl's stomach with both rage and recognition. It was not only her curse, it was theirs too. Yet instead of seeking answers, her family had chosen silence, allowing the horror to grow unchecked. They had buried the truth beneath dinner conversations and locked doors, praying the world would forget, even as the bloodline carried it forward. The girl asked the only question that mattered. "Why didn't you stop it?" Her grandmother's eyes, now wet with something between shame and fear, finally met hers. "Because it is us," she whispered. "Without it, there would be no family left." The words hung in the air like smoke, clinging to every surface. It was not just biology or curse. It was survival, chosen again and again. She realized our family had made peace with something unspeakable, because to resist it would mean unraveling everything they were. The girl felt trapped not just in her own body, but in a legacy stitched together by silence and complicity. The dinner table became unbearable, their faces distorted in her eyes, loved ones and strangers all at once. She stood, journal still clutched in her hands, and left the house. The air outside was cold, but at least it was free. Behind her, she heard the quiet sobs of her mother and the shuddering breath of her grandmother. Sounds not of guilt alone, but of resignation. She realized then that she was carrying more than a child. She was carrying the weight of her entire bloodline, and whether she wanted it or not, it would soon be born again. The journals burned that night. She fed them to the fire in the woods behind her home, watching as the pages curled inward, ink twisting into smoke. But even as the flames consumed the words, the truth did not die. It had already taken root inside her, a part of her body and blood. Destroying the records only meant she could no longer look away from the reflection staring back in the mirror. Her own eyes, wide and desperate, knowing what grew within could not be undone. The weeks dragged forward, each one heavier than the last. Her body swelled, carrying weight too old for her young frame. The doctors called it a marvel, a mystery of nature. They smiled at her test results, fascinated by what they could not explain. But their fascination only deepened her dread. She stopped going to appointments, stopped answering their questions. She knew this was not something that science could measure. It was something far older, whispered through the marrow of her family tree. Alone in her room, she pressed her hands to her stomach and felt the strange rhythm inside, too irregular, too knowing. It was not just life moving, it was memory, inheritance, and perhaps something more. Sometimes she swore she could feel fingers pressing back from within, like someone trying to escape the place they had been trapped for generations. Her dreams blurred with waking hours. She saw herself as an infant, cradled in her grandmother's arms, her tiny body already carrying another. She saw her mother at the same age, her small frame shadowed by the same curse. The images repeated like an old film reel, grainy, looping endlessly. It was a cycle with no beginning and no end, and she realized with terror that she was not living her own life, but replaying one written long before her birth. One night, she whispered into the darkness, "I will not pass this on." But even as she said it, a chill crawled deep down her spine. The blood had been stronger than every vow before hers, stronger than silence, stronger than shame. She was merely another vessel in a chain that stretched backward into shadows too deep to name. The final realization came quietly, in the dead of night, when the movement inside her stilled, as though listening. She understood then that the thing inside her was not separate. It was her. She was mother and child, vessel and legacy, curse and continuation. There was no dividing line. She was both born and unborn, carrying herself forward in an endless echo. The town would never speak of her, just as it had never spoken of those before. But in the hidden places, in the whispered fears of other daughters, in the trembling hands of other mothers, the story would live on. She was not the first. She would not be the last. And when her child's eyes opened, they would already know her secrets, because they had carried them all along.